Hey, it's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and bartonbrostudios.com, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw your own unique character head by adjusting the proportions and the shape of your character's face, placing on their facial features, adjusting them to create some variety, and then, of course, styling the character's hairdo in order to come up with something memorable. I'm going to take you through the entire process, step by step, starting with the foundations, going through the process of actually constructing the head, adjusting the proportions in order to come up with a unique head representation, and then finally polishing that drawing into something that's presentable, something that looks finished, that you can show off to your friends or on social media. And look, if you get some value out of this tutorial, then I highly recommend that you check out my full class on drawing unique character heads, which is available on both howtodrawcomics.net and Skillshare. I've got links to both in the description below. But without further ado, get your pencil and sketchbooks ready or your favorite digital drawing application, and let's jump straight into this. Okay, so we'll start out with our cranium shape, which is just a circle, which we're going to convert into a sphere with a few guidelines in just a moment. The heads that we will draw up today for these examples are just going to be placed on the 3/4 angle. So nothing too dynamic, but they're not going to be flat, front side-on views either. We'll place in the axes, and we'll draw in the horizontal line that runs around the belly of the sphere and ultimately represents the brow line, and then we'll lay in the middle of the face, okay, which tells us what direction the head is looking in, and essentially just shows us where the front of the face will be situated. Next up, we'll place in the side plane. Now here's where we can start to begin messing around with how this general head shape is going to appear. We can either take off a little bit or we can take off a lot of the side of the head plane. Let's go ahead and try to take off just a little bit. Okay, so usually I'd push this out just a little further toward the center line. I'm going to make sure that center line is still placed in the middle of the face. So if I need to readjust it, I'll do that. Now, this is going to affect whether or not the head is narrow or whether or not it's going to be wider than usual a little bit. What will increase and push that effect even further is the length of the face. So is it going to be a long face or is it going to be a short face? Now before, when we were doing the idealized head, we would measure out the first top 2/3 of the face by drawing a line from one side to the other at the top of the temporal flattened out area at the sides of the skull to the other. And that would give us the first 2/3, and then we would just measure down one more third, and we would have the standard measurements of the face. Here, we're going to change things up. We might, in fact, this time around, we'll draw it down a little longer than we have been, so we'll draw it all the way down here. Now, you can push this to an extreme. You can make it a subtle change. It depends on how realistic, really, you want your head to look. If you want to stylize it, create a caricature of whoever it is you're drawing, whatever character it is you might be representing on the page, then, really push that length, pull it right down. Next up, another area where we can really adjust how the shape of the face is going to appear on the page is by going ahead and, adjusting the shape of the jawline. So we could make it more triangular, we could make it more square, and in this case, I think what I'll do is create a bit more of a rectangular jawline. Okay, so I'm actually going to pull the corners of the jaw all the way down. So he's going to have, this particular character, which I'm going to make a male character, will have a fairly, square rectangular jawline. because I've pulled those corners so far down, we can adjust the broadness of the chin. Okay, so again, think about these areas as dials. You know, you can dial the width, how wide certain areas are going to be. You can drag certain portions of the face down further than others. You can pull them up. It's, you know, we're elastifying the face here, essentially, pulling and pushing it into the shape that we want for the given character that we've decided to draw. Now, this might look a bit funny. It might look a little bit odd. And that's because we are traveling outside and away from those idealized measurements. All right, cool. So now that we've got the shape of the jaw defined, and you can choose whatever shape you would like for your own head, you don't necessarily have to copy what I've got here. We can now figure out where the facial features are going to go and how large they are going to be. And again, there's a few adjustment knobs that we can turn here in order to achieve the effects that we're looking for. Now, where are the eyes going to sit on the head? Well, usually they would sit right in the middle of the overall length of the face. In this case, we can sit them either lower or we can sit them higher. What I'm going to do is actually going to place the eyes on this head down quite low. I'm going to place them about, well, actually, no. What I'll do is I'll place them a little bit higher. Because if this was more of an idealized measurement as to where I was going to figure out how to place the eyes, I would probably place them here because that'd be about the midway point of the overall head. But instead of doing that, I'll place them a little bit, well, I'll place them a little bit higher, just underneath the brow line that I've already established. So now we've got a large amount of space for the bottom portion of the face where the nose and the mouth will reside, and a smaller amount of space at the top of the head. So, you know, you've got a very, I guess you could say a character that looks like this is a bit more boneheaded looking in appearance. You know, kind of like Frankenstein almost. You could think of this as. So what I'll do is figure out. So I've got the eyes now placed. Next up, I'll get the nose drawn in there. So is the nose going to be close to the eyes or is it going to be situated further down? Well, you know what? I think I'm going to place it all the way up here. Okay, just underneath the eyes. So again, funny proportions, but it should lead to a very interesting and memorable result for this character. And as for the mouth, I'm going to place that all the way down here. And for the chin, we'll place that down there. Now you could place your mouth and your nose anywhere along this distance between the eyeline and the chin that you would like. It really doesn't matter. Whatever is going to capture the character that you are looking to represent on the page. We'll place in the ears now. We can give this character little ears, or we could give this character big ears. Again, we know what the regular rules are at this point. Now we're bending them, and it can feel a bit funny to break the rules, so to speak, after we spent so long learning them and keeping them in check. But this is a wonderful exercise, and it's only once we have learned the proper rules that we are able to properly manipulate them. Next up, I'll draw in this character's neck. I just feel like this is a thick neck kind of character, so I'm going to give him a thick neck. And now I'll place in the head planes. So we'll have the division that separates the front of the face from the sides of the face on either side here. And then the plane divisions around the side of the brow. Now let's define the hairline. Okay, now what I'll do is I'll give this character what's called a widow's peak hairline. Okay, so it's going to come down to a point in the middle and then back up. There's lots of different hairlines out there that you could look up, but the most common ones that you're going to see are the receding hairline, of course, which some of us are already acquainted with, and the widow's peak hairline, and then just the one that runs straight from one side of the head to the other. There's a few different ones that data away from the regulars, but you could really modify that hairline to make it whatever you want it to look like. Okay, cool. So next, let's actually draw in the facial features. Now, the first question we have to ask ourselves, if we're starting with the eyes, is how big are the eyes going to be, and where are they going to be placed? Will they be small and placed far apart, or will they be large and placed close together? Right? We can really have some fun with this. I am going to go for some small eyes that are placed a little more toward the middle of the head. And of course, we can mess around with the eye shapes as well. So I want this guy to look kind of intimidating. He's going to have a bit of a glare about him. So I'm going to make the top of the eyes quite straight. And I'm going to narrow them out as well. So they're very small eyes. And as I said, they're placed right at the front of the face, which has this kind of, predator-like vibe about it. Because, you think about a lion, for example, or a tiger, these animals that are predators that hunt other animals down, and their eyes are always placed at the front of their face. And they're quite small as well. So that's the kind of vibe that we're going for here. That's what we're able to incorporate. And that's the association that hopefully people will make to the character as well. Now what we'll do is go ahead and add in some eyebrows, which are going to sit right on top of his eyes here. And I'm going to make them really thick too. If you're doing your own head, that, is something different to this, try to get inventive with it, get creative. Maybe you do thin eyebrows that sit really high up on the forehead. That's totally something that you could go with. Of course, use your eye to judge whether or not something is going to look good. Because though we can bend these rules, they can ultimately break if we bend them too much in the wrong direction. Okay, wonderful. Now let's go ahead and draw in the nose. So we'll start with the bottom of the nose. And we'll make this nose quite wide. Again, just to really push that bonehead appearance, that caveman appearance that we're going for. We can have the nostrils going upward on an upward angle. We could have them going on a downward angle. Basically, every single aspect of the facial shape and features and measurements can be tweaked in order to ultimately end up at a varied result to what you would otherwise have if you were just going with the standard measurements for the human head. Next, we'll go and place in the mouth. So we'll start out with the opening for that, beginning with the middle, and then pulling the mouth opening all the way out. And you know what? We'll give him quite a large mouth. So now what he'll end up with is this monkey-like appearance, I would say, this ape-like appearance. We'll give him a big bottom lip, which is already kind of written within the construction that we laid down to begin with, because of the fact that we laid in his chin so far down below the opening of the mouth. Now, of course, we've got the ears too, so we'll draw those in. And you can see that I'm working very, very lightly here, so it might be a little bit difficult to see what I'm doing, but this is really the way in which you want to work. You don't want to be using a super dark and heavy line that's hard to erase, that's hard to recorrect and tweak if you decide that you want to change things later on. So what I'll do now is I will refine what I've placed down here on the page before going through and establishing a hairstyle for this character. So we'll start out with the eyes. I'm going over the top of what I've already done here, just with a darker outline. And refining essentially what's already there on the page. So this is the easy part, believe it or not. You know, adding in those details, polishing up the primary contours. That's when everything really, when the roadmap should be laid out and you know exactly where this piece is going to be going. You really don't want too much to be left up to chance at this point. So the idea with any illustration, whether it be a drawing of a head or a full character or a full cover or pinup, right, is that you want to make sure that you've planned it all out first. Once it's planned, then it's very, very easy to go over the top of that and lay on the icing on top, right? So it's about, you know, making sure that that cake is nicely baked, and then, you know, once you know that's good to go, well, you can then polish it up. Place the icing on top, place the cherry or the decoration and whatnot. Place in his iris and his pupil. And we'll do that in both eyes. Next, we'll outline the eyebrows, going over the top of them, defining that line with additional clarity. And what I'm looking for is nice, smooth, well-weighted lines in the final drawing. Okay, so I want these lines to no longer be sketchy. And I don't want them to necessarily be light either. I want them to be nice and vivid. I think polished is the best term. But we're essentially cleaning up what we had initially on the page, and we're turning it into a finished drawing. Every now and then I might hit the undo button, or if I'm doing this traditionally, go ahead and get out my eraser. If there's a certain portion of the drawing that's not necessarily going the way that I want it to go, and I'll make whatever changes are needed. So you saw on those eyebrows there that I kind of wanted to fix them up a little bit. Oh, what is that? All right. So we'll do the same thing with the opposite eyebrow. Again, outlining it first. And then placing in the I guess the textural rendering to describe it as having hair. Now we'll add in some additional details around the eyes, just to describe some of the forms, such as the eye socket and the folds underneath the bottom eyelid. And all that does is just describe some of the anatomy around that area, subtly, but just enough to give it that extra visual interest. in realism. It takes it from looking like just a cartoon and actually, pushes a more complex looking comic art style while still maintaining, something that looks like a piece of comic book art, something that looks stylized and graphic in nature. Okay, so we've got the eyes drawn in there. Now let's place in the nose. And before I actually draw in the nose, what I'm going to do is I'll start off by erasing some of these construction lines because they're getting in the way a little bit, and we really don't need them anymore at this point. They were only there so that we knew where to place the facial features. Now that we've got those facial features placed, we can just do some erasing. Now I'm going to place in some folds and wrinkles around the brow. And, these folds and wrinkles are caused by the muscles underneath the face that contract and contort in order to express certain emotions visually within the facial expressions the head is capable of. And over time, if there's, for example, a person who is typically very smiley, who smiles all the time, they will develop wrinkles and folds in the areas of their face that use the muscles to actually allow them to smile. If there's someone who glares all the time, they're walking around angry and whatnot, then again, they will develop the same lines and folds in their face that they use in order to allow them to express those particular facial expressions. Okay, so I'm going to lay in a shape for the nose bridge. Now keep in mind, there's a number of different shapes that you can use for the nose, especially the bridge. So if I go over here and I draw the nose from the side, well, you've got this kind of beak nose that you can use for the nose. This beak-like shape. I guess I guess this would be more of a beak shape, wouldn't it? So you can play around with these, experiment, and see what you can come up with. It uses the same bits and pieces. You can have a nose that is pointed upward, where you're going to see more of that underside plane, at least from the front. You can have all different sorts of noses. The variety of noses that you could have is endless. I've decided on this particular nose shape for the character that I'm drawing here. Place in the nostril. Even on our idealized heads, we still had nostrils and whatnot. It's just that now they're depicted differently in order to create the variations that we're seeing in this gentleman's face. I'm going to draw in some wrinkles around the sides of his nose. He's an angry dude. And I really want that to come across in this character. We can add in little bits of rendering to his face if we really want to polish this up and make it more complete. We'll leave it at that for now though. I'm going for more of a stylized look in here in these particular head examples. Next up, we'll define the opening of his mouth. Drawing that in. Place in a darker, heavier line just underneath his bottom lip. We'll even outline and suggest the shape of the bottom lip at the sides there. And now we'll go ahead and place in some light rendering just underneath the bottom lip. to describe that underside plane, the space between the bottom lip and the top of the chin. I'm going to lay in the nostril opening. All I will do to prepare that and fill it in is draw this little comma type shape underneath the nostril opening, fill it in. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to do some more erasing here, getting rid of those construction lines. And I'll start to define some of the underlying facial anatomy, suggesting where the cheekbones might reside, and the mouth muzzle as well. I'll start off by lightly sketching those in. And then once I think I'm happy with what I'd like to capture there, what I want to go for, I'll use a darker outline to essentially set it in stone. You can see I'm doubling up some of these lines just to add that little tiny bit more depth to the contour drawing. And that's all you need sometimes. You don't need heavy rendering in order to give your artwork depth, to suggest form. It's funny coming from me because I do have a style which is much more detailed than this, where I do really pack on the rendering. But again, it's not always that necessary, and sometimes it can take away from the drawing. It can steal away the attention from certain other aspects of it. Okay, next up we'll draw in the chin, and for this character I'm going to give him a bit of a bum chin. Yes, you can have different shapes of chin as well, believe it or not. We'll put a little dimple just in the base there. All right, that's looking pretty good. We'll lay a little indentation in around the corners of the mouth to push them back and just to create a little pocket within the anatomy there. Curve in the underside of the brow back in toward the eye on the far side of the face. Then pull out the cheekbone to describe the shape of the face as it turns away from us. So we're getting a good look at the outline of the front of the face here on this angle in this portion. Now, a lot of the decisions I'm making here are instinctual. Over time, you'll develop your own way of creating decisions and making them in order to arrive at the idealized representation of whatever head it is you would like to draw. And by idealize in that context, I just mean what you desire to see within your head when you've drawn it. I'm going to add in a few more facial folds in around the nose. I'll draw those out, especially around the mouth, because the mouth and the eyes, they're both facial features that have a wide capability of expression. Because of that wide capability of expression, you'll find that a lot of the folds in the face reside within and around those facial features. Now, the forehead, obviously, we know that that can really, fold up and create lines across the top there. So that's another area of the head that moves around a lot. That the forehead is somewhat connected to the eyes. In other words, when the eyebrows raise, those folds within the forehead are going to begin to form. We'll add in that little dimple, that little indentation just above the top lip. And now we'll complete his jawline. Run a dark contour down the sides. And then here I'm going to shave off the sharp corner that I added in there right at the edge and adjust the shape. And then I'll take the bottom edge of the jaw and lead it into the chin. Next, I'll define the side jaw muscle. It's the back of the jaw. A very powerful muscle. Gives the jaw a lot of its power. And again, how much you define the anatomy of your character's face is completely up to you and the requirements of that character. For example, we're going to do up a female head in just a little bit, and she will not have anywhere near the level of defining features and anatomy as this particular character does. Might add in some shading just on the underside of his top lip there to show that, yes, indeed, it is facing away from the light source. And now, as for the ears, let's do something interesting with these ears. Let's add in like a piercing. I'm not quite sure what you call these particular earrings, but I've seen them before. They sit inside the earlobe and stretch it out quite a lot, actually. And so this is a great way to customize the shape of the ear while also adding a facial accessory to it. So we'll go ahead and place that in there. And now we'll attend to the top of the ear, beginning at the final outline for its shape. And we'll lead that down into the base of the ear, which will travel around this earring that we've placed down. You can see quite a significant customization of the ear's general overall shape. But just as before, the next step that we're going to take is place in the interior frame of the outer ear. And then the Y-shaped piece of cartilage will draw in. And so, remember that as much as we are following a structure for the face, that structure can be stretched, as the ears indicate here. The shape of the ear has literally been stretched out in order to create a new representation for it. Finally, we'll add in the neck. That drawn in. And we'll indicate some of the muscles. Especially those large band-like muscles that run down from behind the ear and into the center of the collarbone. They are usually quite prominent and will be visible on the surface of the skin. We could also add in the Adam's apple. A male character here. Believe it or not, women actually have an Adam's apple as well. It's just not as pronounced or as visible as it is on a man. But women share the same anatomy for the most part, in fact, as far as the human face is concerned. Okay, well, that's fantastic. So now that we've got our face defined and figured out, it's time to give our character a hairstyle. So this is something that we haven't touched on a whole lot. And what I'm going to do now is explain my approach to it. So the first thing I like to do is figure out, well, what kind of style am I going to go with for this character's hair? And then the next step after that is to, well, let's just go ahead and and I'll actually show you. So sometimes sometimes I don't exactly know what style I want the character's hair to go in, and I'll just start drawing it out like this, and I'll see what happens. And what I do is I'll start laying in large clumps of hair. But I want a general idea to go with here so that I can follow a particular direction. So this guy will be a gangster of some kind, which means I'm thinking that he's going to have slightly longer hair on top and maybe shorter hair around the sides. And so with that said, I'm going to begin drawing out the larger portions of this hairstyle that define its overall shape. And then the strategy from that point onward will be to divide those larger shapes up into smaller shapes more and more until we get a certain amount of texture and organic appeal to the hair that we're drawing down onto this character's head. So you can see here that I'm keeping it very light and very wispy, very free flowing. And I'm lightly drawing it in there. And unless you see this actually happening, it can be, everybody who teaches this stuff tends to say, if you read it in books, knock out the overall shape of the hairstyle first. But that can be hard to interpret sometimes. At least I've found it hard to interpret anyway. So I need to see it done. And so this is the way in which I came up with for actually laying in the general shape of my character's overall hairstyle. I somewhat mix in some textural qualities to it. In other words, I try to suggest that it's already hair as I'm laying in that basic overall shape. And I think about how the hair might fold on itself. So it's, in a sense, it's almost like fabric. It folds on itself. It has layers to it, and it is at the whim of the outside elements. So if your character is standing in the wind or they're standing in the rain, that's going to change how the hair is represented, even if it's got a certain shape to it or a certain style to it. Okay, so got his hair drawn out very roughly, the general overall shape of it. But then, of course, it's shorter around the sides. And so the way in which I'm going to represent that is I'm just going to have it combed back, or appearing as though it's combed back. Now, of course, you could have it completely shaved, and different people interpret a shaved head in different ways. So it could be prickly like this, if you wanted to go for it. I've found that gangsters tend to use a lot of grease in their hair, a lot of mousse, and they kind of slick it back. I'm a big fan of gangster movies, actually. Maybe that's why I thought of this character, today's demonstration. In all honesty, I didn't have any idea that I was going to come up with this character, actually. I just started tweaking the proportions, and the character came about. And maybe you'll find that that's the same case for you as well. And sometimes the things that you draw, you just come up with them on a whim, and all of a sudden it can really, take its own, it can end up taking on its own life. I'm actually going to tweak the trajectory of some of these, the side hair texture, because I didn't quite like the way in which it was flowing. It seemed a little bit too straight. It wasn't really wrapping around the curved surface of the side of the head in the way that I wanted it to. So in this case, the hair, because it's sitting so close to the head and it's combed right up against it, it will describe its shape just a little bit. All right, but where do we take the hair from here? Well, we can actually start to divide it up now. So essentially what we've established is the overall shape of the hairstyle and the direction in which it's going to flow. And so all the lines that we add in now to increase the detail, to break it up, are going to follow that same flow. We're going to follow what we've already laid down. We're taking those larger clumps of hair and now we're just breaking them up. And we're breaking them up in much the same way we would break up the eyebrow hair. Okay, so as we lay in these contours, we're going to have some of them sitting very close together, others that are sitting very far apart. That's what's going to give the hair that we're drawing for our heads that organic visual representation, because hair is very organic in nature. It's somewhat randomized. And you'll notice that these lines are very long and very elegant, so you do need somewhat of a steady hand in order to lay them in delicately. Really focus on the thickness of the line that you're laying down. You can see that I'm keeping mine quite thin. And in fact, the only thick lines that I ever lay down onto the page is for the outline of the character. All the lines on the interior of the drawing, unless it's a main section like the underside of the cheekbones, for example, I'll usually use a thicker line. But other than that, I usually try to, keep, especially the minor lines like the folds in the face and whatnot, and these divisions in the hair, I try to keep them thin and subtle because I don't want them drawing too much attention to themselves. There's a hierarchy of visual interpretation that needs to be cultivated when it comes to your drawings. In other words, there's certain areas within the drawing that you want the viewer to pay attention to first. And usually those areas are going to be the ones with thick outlines placed around them. So the eyes, for example, have thick outlines around them, and that's where the viewer's attention will go first most of the time, for a number of other reasons too, but that's definitely one of them. And so you don't want the viewer to be honing in, for example, on the individual separations within the hair. You want them to be more focused on the general hairstyle as a whole, right? And so you outline the general hairstyle as a whole with a thicker outline. But then, in order for that visual interpretation to unfold in the correct way, you keep the interior hair details less obvious, less prominent, with subtler line work. So I'm going around this entire hair shape, and I'm dividing it up while at the same time defining its overall style. On the bottom of the hair, we might give it a slightly thicker outline, just to show that it is raised up off of the head. Because in most situations, there's going to be a bit of a cast shadow created by the hair down onto the forehead. And that just gives it that little bit more elevation, that little bit more volume. You want to be thinking about what kind of hair your character has as well. We have some very slicked back, straight, sharp looking hair here, but maybe your character has curly hair. And we'll do an example of curly hair in just a bit. But it's certainly something to keep in mind. As I said, there's variations to almost everything that we're learning about throughout this workshop. Everything can be shifted, everything can change, and you'll notice that it's actually okay to change the rules up. It's not like anything bad necessarily happens. But as I've said before many times over, you've got to know what the rules are in order to shift them properly without creating fundamental errors within your illustrations. So, in other words, proportions that look off. Now, even though these aren't the idealized proportions, there's still some proportions which have been applied to this character's head that, if maintained and kept consistent, kept symmetrized properly, will ultimately achieve and give us the ability to be able to represent this character's head from one panel to the next in whatever comic we might draw them in, and have the viewer recognize them as being the same character. So in other words, if you're able to keep in mind what the proportions were that you changed for your character's head in comparison to the idealized measurements that we initially came up with, then you should be able to draw that same character from a multitude of different angles and still have them look like the same character. All right, so it all comes down to the proportions of the character that you've chosen to go for and how you've adjusted them. If you remember how you adjusted them, what you modified from the initial idealized head in order to come up with your new unique head, then that'll be the key to making your characters look the same from one panel to the next. I get that question a lot, You have to also remember, though, that people can look very, very different in the profile view when compared to the front view. They're two extremely different angles. And so in that case, what will allow you to draw the assumption that you're looking at the same character in those dramatically different angles is things like hair color, things like design elements that you might have incorporated into the face of the character or even into their overall outfit. And then once you've drawn that character in the front view once you've drawn that character in the side view once, then you want to make sure that the next time around, the next time you draw them in those views, that once again, that consistency is there. Okay, so I'm going to go around and add in the final hair for the sides of the head. Still might divide that up a little bit more. Again, I'm trying to give the hair some movement, some liveliness to it. And you can see, especially here around the sides of the head, I'm using this, it's called the Line of Beauty. It's a wavy, S-like curve, which seems to have an appealing energy to it when you incorporate it into your drawings. And this same shape can be applied to the overall pose of your character. It can be applied to design elements that you've incorporated into them. It can be really applied to many, many different aspects of your drawing, including the overall composition. It's a very natural movement for the hand to make. And I guess the reason that it's got so much energy to it is because it's moving the entire way through. There's no point at which it straightens out. It's a line that encompasses movement. it's curving in a different direction the entire way along its trajectory. Okay, so that actually completes this first head example that we've drawn up here. We'll go around the far side of his forehead and just define the outline for it before we wrap it up. But once more, what I would like to do before we call this 100% done is just to show you a variety of different facial features and whatnot, as we did with the noses, that you could potentially go with for these head customizations. Now, we've got the jawline here, and the jawline could either be triangular, like so. It could be extremely triangular, depending on how far you would like to push it. You have a very tiny little chin, very, very sharp chin. You could have a square jawline, a very broad chin. You could have a square jawline with very narrow chin. You could have a long jawline, or you could have a very squashed and short jawline. As for eyes, well, you could have round eyes. With like bags underneath them if you wanted to. You could have very narrow eyes. Very intimidating looking eyes like this. You could have sad looking eyes. Or you could also call these innocent eyes, I guess. And you could have, I guess, you know, similar to sad eyes, but more like an old person's eyes, like a elderly person, where the top of the eye is actually hanging over the opening quite a lot. Something like this. That would also work. And there's a lot of different eyes that you could come up with here. There's an endless amount, an endless variety of them. Different types of ears. Oh yeah, for sure. So you could have Oriental eyes. So something that looks a little bit more like this. This is, again, everybody's going to have their own interpretation, but this is how I would draw them. It's subtle. The thing about Oriental eyes is you're not always going to necessarily want to, at least in terms of idealization, you don't necessarily want to define that top eyelid, the crease in the top eyelid too much, because typically what you'll find is that it's not as prominent. And also the Oriental eyes are typically quite dark as well. So you may want to go ahead and add in some additional shading to them as well. And you might have an eyebrow up here. Off. So, again, and you've got different types of mouths. So you could have a puckered mouth, a mouth that sits higher but is smaller in width. There's something like this, where the top lip is maybe a little larger than the bottom lip. You could have a mouth that's very broad, but still sits a little higher. And I find that this can be quite cool for characters that are kind of grimacing, and maybe they might have a larger bottom lip. You can even mess around with this bottom underside muscle around the base of the muzzle. Have a mouth that's kind of curled up at the sides. And these almost look just like facial expressions, and sometimes the lines can be blurred a little bit, but you've likely seen people in real life that have some of these variations incorporated into them. Where I just know someone whose mouth curls up at the sides. It almost looks like they got a little smirk going on most of the time. Um, but yeah, so there's lots of different types of faces that you can go for. You can customize each and every single part of them, and even the chin, right? Like you could have a broad separated chin like this. You could have a skinny one like this. Yeah. You could have a square, smooth one, etc. So get inventive with it. See what you can come up with, and try to create heads that sometimes, maybe not always, but sometimes travel outside of that idealized model that we so commonly see within comic books. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and that you got a ton of value out of it. And if you did, and you'd like to delve deeper into the topic, then I highly suggest you check out the full class that this lesson is a part of. I've got links to it in the description below. It is available on both howtodrawcomics.net and Skillshare. And what it's going to show you is even more examples of how to add variety to the head shape, facial features, and hairstyles of your characters. We'll even talk about adding head accessories and makeup to make them even more memorable. Alright, well that's it from me today. Until next time, keep drawing.